Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. In the comments, let me know where you are watching this video before we start. Today, we're going to explore the misty mountains of Tennessee. This is a place where justice took a long time. Distances were great, and secrets could be buried with the leaves in the valleys that were far away from everyone else. The year was 1911. The world hadn't been through the Great War yet. The dirt roads didn't have many cars, and electric lights were a people who live in the mountainous southern United States can only dream of this faraway luxury. Eastern Tennessee was a very beautiful place with thick forests covering what seemed like endless mountains and small towns that were very far away from each other. There were laws of man and laws of nature in these lands, and the laws of nature did not always win. Isaac McAllister was like any other man in his community. At age 43, he worked as a lumberjack and sometimes as a guide for people who had to go through the dangerous trails. That went all the way through the Appalachians. Isaac knew every creek, every canyon, and every secret road that could save lots of time. He was quiet and didn't say much. He lived alone in a log cabin about 5 miles from Greenbrier, the nearest village. The cabin was in a clearing with old oak trees all around it. It was close to a stream that never dried up, even in the hottest summers. People in Greenbrier had different thoughts about Isaac. Some people saw him as a man who worked hard and could be counted on, worked and never said no to help when asked. But some people whispered different stories. People said he had a bad temper and talked to himself when he thought no one was listening. They also said that looking into his eyes for too long could be scary. But these were mountains where everyone had their own problems, and Isaac McAllister seemed like any other man who was lonely and worked hard. On a cold November afternoon that year, everything changed. A merchant on the road named Thomas Whitmore showed up in Greenbrier with his. A wagon full of different things, from clothes to farm tools. Thomas looked like he was upset. The local sheriff, Henry Caldwell, was told that he had seen something very scary when he had driven by Isaac McAllister's property 2 days before. Thomas said that the porch of the cabin had blood on it, and when he called for Isaac, no one answered. Even scarier, Thomas was sure he heard low moans coming from somewhere near the property, but he was too scared to go check it out. More. At first, Sheriff Caldwell wasn't sure. Isaac McAllister often went hunting, and animal blood was common on his land. Another thing about Thomas Whitmore was that he was known for being nervous and seeing danger where there wasn't much of it. The sheriff changed his mind, though, because Thomas kept insisting and his voice was shaking. He got 3 men from the village together, including the blacksmith Robert Haynes and the pastor of the village church, Josiah Turner, the next morning to look for Isaac McAllister's land. It took about 2 hours to get to the cabin. On one side of the path were cliffs, and on the other were thick forests. The path was steep and dangerous. As of November, the trees no longer had any leaves on them, and bare branches hung over the trails like skeletal fingers. The sky was full of gray clouds that made it look like snow would fall at any time. When they finally saw Isaac's cabin in the clearing, there was a heavy silence. The spot. The only sound was the cold wind whistling through the tree trunks. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, and there were no sounds of animals or work. Sheriff Caldwell got off the horse first and walked slowly to the porch. The blood stains that Thomas Whitmore had talked about were still there. They were darker now because of time and moisture, but they were still there. Stains that don't look right spread like a scary trail across the wooden planks and down the stairs. The police officer came to the door and asked for Isaac. Nothing. This time he knocked again. It got louder, and the door opened with a squeak on its rusty hinges. The inside of the cabin was a mess. Things were flipped over. Things that were on the floor were broken. There were clear signs that something bad had happened. But there was no body. It's not Isaac McAllister. But there was a smell. Men covered their noses with handkerchiefs because of a strong, unpleasant smell. Sheriff Caldwell had been a police officer in this remote area for decades, so he knew the smell well. It was clear as day, the smell of death. With growing fear, Sheriff Caldwell and his men began searching the property. Pastor Josiah Turner saw a shovel leaning against the cabin wall. The blade of the shovel still had dirt on it from the previous day. The blacksmith, Robert Haynes, found an abandoned axe near the barn. The handle had dark stains that looked like they had been cleaned quickly. With each new clue, the mystery grew, and the feeling that something terrible had happened in this remote area grew. Behind the house, the ground gently sloped toward the stream, and the men saw that it had been moved in 3 different places. The disturbed areas were shaped like rough rectangles, each about 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. This area of the ground was loose and had recently been moved. Small stones had been piled on top of each spot to make them stand out or protect them. The cold November wind blew the leaves around, showing and hiding this disturbing evidence. He didn't have to be an experienced detective to know what this could mean. The man told the men to get their tools and start digging. At that time of year, the Appalachian soil was starting to get hard because winter was coming, but it still gave way when the shovels were used on it. He prayed quietly while they worked, but it was hard to hear what he was saying over the sound of the tools hitting rocks and roots. Not long after, they found their first horrible thing. They found dead bodies wrapped in an old, torn blanket less than a meter below the surface of the first site they dug up. The body was already decomposing a lot, so it couldn't be identified right away, but it was clearly an adult. The men backed away in horror. Robert Haynes, the blacksmith, had to move out of the way to throw up behind a tree. He was barely able to keep his cool as Sheriff Caldwell told them to go on. At the second site, another equally strange find was made. More human remains, this time wrapped in cloth and in a state that suggests they had been buried for weeks or months. The third and final site confirmed what had been happening before. These men. Isaac McAllister had done more than just break the law. No one in Greenbrier knew about his secret cemetery until that moment. He had turned his private land into one. But where was Isaac? As the sheriff looked at the 3 makeshift graves, this question kept going through his mind. The man had vanished, leaving behind proof of terrible crimes. Had he run away when he saw that Thomas Whitmore had seen the blood? Was he hiding in a cave in the mountains nearby? Was he watching from afar as the police searched his property? Or did something even worse happen to him? That's when Sheriff Caldwell decided they needed more help and a doctor to look at the bodies. He left Haynes, the blacksmith, to watch over the property and went back to Greenbrier with Pastor Turner. There, they sent urgent telegrams to the neighboring county asking for help. It was hard to talk to people back then, and the distances seemed even bigger. It would take at least 2 days for skilled help get to this faraway part of Tennessee. While they were waiting, word quickly spread through the village about what had been found on Isaac McAllister's land. People in Greenbrier started to remember things that didn't seem important at the time. A woman named Martha Perkins talked about how her hunter husband, William, had gone missing in the mountains 9 months before. He left in February and said he'd be back before it got dark, but no one ever saw him again. At the time, there was no sign of anything, and everyone thought William had lost his way or died in an accident in a canyon. Ernest Shaw, an old farmer who lived in the area, remembered 2 drifters who had been through the area the previous summer. The men were going west to find work in the new sawmills that were opening up in the mountains. Ernest saw them talking to Isaac McAllister near the road. Isaac helped them find their way to the trails. No one paid any attention, but the drifters were never seen again after that day. A lot of drifters were on those roads, and many people just kept going without leaving a trace. With 3 bodies buried on Isaac's land, these disappearances took on a more sinister tone. How many other people might have been in Isaac McAllister's path and never been seen again? In that remote clearing, how many lost travelers, hunters, or workers looking for work had put their trust in this ordinary-looking man and met a terrible end? As soon as the county coroner, a professional, named, there were finally some answers thanks to Samuel Porter, but each one made the questions even more troubling. Dr. Porter was very careful. He went to a university in the north and had experience with criminal cases, which is not common in this Appalachian area. He carefully looked at the bodies that were found in the 3 graves and wrote down lots of notes in his old leather notebook. On a cold afternoon, they told Sheriff Caldwell what they had found in Isaac McAllister's cabin, which had been used as a makeshift office for the investigation. Main office. The 3 sets of remains were all from adults, and all of them looked like men. The different stages of decomposition suggest that they did not all die at the same time. Based on what Dr. Porter thinks, the first body may have been buried 8 to 10 months ago. The second one, maybe 5 or 6 months. The third one looked like it was made more recently, maybe just 6 to 8 weeks before the discovery. The most disturbing piece of evidence, though, was the type of injuries that Dr. Porter could see, even with the most advanced technology. With skull fractures, broken ribs, and other signs of blunt force trauma, the victims had been through a lot of violence before they died. No gory details were given by the doctor, but it was clear that these people had not died peacefully. A person had been brutal on purpose, and it was most likely Isaac McAllister, although Dr. Porter was doing his tests. Other investigators looked in every part of the property for more proof. They found a wooden chest hidden under something inside the cabin. The floorboards, which can be reached by a loose board. The things inside that chest showed an even darker side of the case. Some of the things that were stolen were wallets made of leather, knives of different shapes and sizes, a wedding ring with initials engraved on it, some silver coins, and even different people's IDs. A work certificate in the name of William Perkins, the trapper who had not been seen in 9 months, was among the papers. Also, there was a letter sent to a family in Kentucky. It was never sent. It was signed by a man named James Rutherford. There was a trip through the Tennessee mountains in the letter, and there was talk of meeting a local guide who knew the trails. It was written in June 1910, which is more than a year before the discoveries on the McAllister property. Most likely, each item in that trunk stood for a life that was cut short. A story that had a sad ending in those remote mountains. Sheriff Caldwell started making a list of all the reported disappearances in the area over the last 2 years and compared it to things that were found. It was scary to see the pattern that started to form. Isaac McAllister seemed to be after people who were traveling alone, didn't have many connections in the area, or whose absence might not be noticed because of the natural dangers of the mountains. As the investigation went on, the cabin itself revealed more secrets. They found dirty tools that had been quickly hidden in the barn, under a pile of old hay. Investigators saw that some floorboards in the cabin itself seemed to have been recently replaced, and when they took them off, they saw stains on the ground below that showed someone had tried to clean it. It seemed like the whole property was a silent reminder of crimes that had happened over a long period of time. But the main question was still not answered. In what place was Isaac McAllister? The sheriff set up search teams that spent days looking in the mountains nearby. They checked every known trail, knocked on the doors of cabins that were out in the middle of nowhere, and talked to other loggers. Isaac knew that territory better than any other person in the area. If he had wanted to hide in the wilderness of the Appalachians, it would have been very hard to find him. Some people in Greenbrier thought Isaac might have run away to another state. The Tennessee mountains were on the border between North Carolina and Virginia. If someone was really determined, they could cross those borders on trails that weren't shown on maps. Some people thought he might be hiding in one of the many caves in the area and waiting for the search to end before moving on. There were also people who came up with a darker idea. People knew that the Appalachians would not forgive those who disrespected them. Deep canyons, streams that grew very fast after it rained, and temperatures that dropped too low at night in the winter. In his haste to get away, Isaac might have died in the mountains he knew so well had he fallen off a cliff, been carried away by a rapid, or just died of cold in a remote place where his body would never be found. The winter of 1911 came in full force in the mountains of Tennessee. A lot of snow started to fall, covering the trails and making it almost impossible to search. Sheriff Caldwell had to temporarily stop work in the fields, but he promised to start them up again when the weather got better in the spring. When Isaac McAllister's cabin was sealed, it became proof of crimes that shocked even people who were used to living in the mountains. As the snow fell silently on the mountains, the investigation changed directions. Caldwell began as sheriff, exploring Isaac McAllister's past to find out how a man who seemed normal could have done such horrible things. He found a story that was broken up and full of holes and contradictions. It was like Isaac had spent his whole life trying to hide his tracks. As Isaac McAllister had come to Greenbrier in the winter of 1899, about 12 years before. He told the few people who asked that he came from the West. He never talked about his family, never got any mail, and never showed any. A link to the past. He paid a lot of cash for the remote property, which made some people look twice at the time, but no one remembered. Men were always going in and out of those mountains, each with their own stories and secrets to share. In order to find Isaac McAllister, the sheriff sent telegrams to different parts of Tennessee and to states that were close by. Responses came slowly, thanks to messengers who had to brave the snowy roads. Isaac McAllister had worked in a sawmill in Missouri years ago, but the description of the person didn't match. In the records of a Virginia county, there was another Isaac McAllister, but that person had died in 1895. It was like Greenbrier's Isaac had just appeared out of thin air, with no history, roots, or identity that could be checked. A person who used to live in Greenbrier but moved east years ago made an especially interesting discovery. Preston Hughes, the man, wrote to the sheriff after reading about the case in the paper. Moreno remembered something that happened in 1933, not long after Isaac moved to the area. Marcus Denton had gone missing while looking at remote mountain properties as a land salesman. Marcus was looking at land for a northern development company and planned to make offers to small landowners to buy it. It was thought that his last stop was close to Isaac McAllister's property. At the time, the most popular idea was that Marcus Denton had either decided to go back north without finishing his business or had an accident. An accident on the dangerous trails. No one looked into it any further because the man didn't have any family in the area, and his employer eventually sent someone else. With the new information we have learned, the disappearance became much scarier. Marcus Denton may have been one of Isaac's first victims. Were there more bodies buried somewhere on that property or in the woods nearby? Even though it was winter, the medical examiner, Dr. Porter, kept up his careful work. He was able to positively identify one of the bodies as that of missing hunter William Perkins based on physical traits that his widow, Martha Perkins, confirmed with tears in her eyes. It was harder to figure out who the other two bodies were. Dr. Porter had to use things found in the hidden trunk to make likely connections, since there were no preserved dental records or other features that would have helped him tell the person apart. One of the bodies was thought to be that of James Rutherford, the man from the smelly letter. Initials were carved into the wedding ring that was found in the trunk. That was the same as James's full name. The third body had not been identified. It was an unknown soul whose final resting place in the Tennessee mountains would never be fully understood. The lack of a personality made the case even more sad. Someone lived, traveled, and waited for a future that never came, and now not even his name could be brought back. As winter went on, news came in of other disappearances that could be linked to the case. A woman in a nearby county said that her brother, A.N. In his last letter, the wandering worker said he was going to cross the mountains near Greenbrier to find work in the copper mines further south. The brother hadn't been seen or heard from since that letter in August 1910. There was another report from a boarding house in a town 3 days' drive away. The owner talked about 3 prospectors who had left for the mountains in the spring of 1919. The men said they were looking for gold in the streams in the Appalachians and had asked about reliable guides in the area. Each new report painted a picture that was more and more disturbing. Isaac McAllister used his knowledge of the trails and reputation as a trustworthy guide to get people to come to his remote property. He had their trust because they needed him. In Tennessee's dangerous mountains, having a guide with a lot of experience could mean the difference between life and death. No one thought that the guide might be the biggest danger of all. Sheriff Caldwell spent many nights. That winter, they tried to figure out what was going on in Isaac McAllister's mind. What got a man to start killing other people? Was it greed for the few things travelers brought with them? Did it look like something bad? Some urge that goes against common sense? Old watches, a few coins, and ordinary knives were in the hidden trunk, but they weren't worth a fortune. If the goal was to steal, Isaac had put everything at risk for not much. The sheriff was also confused by the question of how things could work. How had Isaac been able to hide what he was doing for so long? The property wasn't so far away that neighbors wouldn't walk by sometimes. Thomas Whitmore, the merchant who started the investigation, often went to the area. Why hadn't anyone seen anything fishy before the bloodstains on the porch? The sheriff came to the conclusion that the answer lay in the mountains themselves. People learned not to ask too many questions, to respect each other's space, and to accept that some mysteries were just part of mountain life. When spring finally came to the Tennessee mountains in 1912, it brought a thaw and a new start for nature. Sheriff Caldwell started looking for Isaac McAllister again with even more determination. After some changes, the search parties now have experienced trackers from nearby counties and even a trained bloodhound that was loaned by a farmer in Virginia. There was no doubt that they would find Isaac if he was still alive and hiding in those mountains. At first, the search was limited to the known caves in the area. The Appalachians were filled with limestone formations that made cave systems that were very complicated. Some were explored and mapped, while others were never seen before. The men went down with ropes and oil lanterns to explore damp, dark passages where it was completely silent and the air smelled like old earth. They looked everywhere and found bats, small underground streams, and beautiful rock formations, but Isaac McAllister was nowhere to be found. Then they broadened their search to include the most remote areas, places that not even the most experienced hunters often went. The forest floor had only faint signs of trails. There were deep valleys where the sun never got to, even in the middle of summer, and canyons where the wind howled like animals in pain. They found something during one of these trips that would completely change the way they did their research. Trackers found the remains of an old campfire in a narrow valley about 15 kilometers north of Isaac's land. The fire had been covered with moss and small plants. There were rags of clothing next to the campfire, wore down with age and water. There were also human bones nearby, partly hidden by leaves and twigs. Dr. Porter was called to the scene right away. After a quick look, he was sure that the remains belonged to an adult and had been out in the weather for a few months, maybe since late fall of the previous year. The question would have to keep going through everyone's mind. Were those Isaac McAllister's dead body parts? Had he run away to that remote valley only to die there, by himself and in the open, the harsh winter in the Appalachians? Or was this just another unknown victim who got lost in those harsh mountains and died alone, far from anyone who could help them? The clothes were in too bad of shape to be used for identification, and there were no physical traits that could be used to tell who it was for sure. Sheriff Caldwell made sure that the body parts were carefully taken back to Greenbrier so that Dr. Reporter could do a more thorough examination. In the meantime, the trackers kept going, exploring the valley and the areas around it. More proof that someone had been there for a while was found. A small hole in the rocks looked like it had been used as a temporary home, and there were signs that fish had been caught and cooked near a stream. Anyone who had been there had tried to stay alive, but the mountains in the winter were not interested in their efforts. Back in the village, Dr. Reporter spent days looking at the bones that had been found in the valley. He counted the bones and looked for any features that could help them identify Isaac McAllister and compared the measurements to the little physical information they had. Even though the clothes were worn out, there were pieces of a woolen coat that looked like the ones Isaac usually wore. There were also the remains of tough work boots like the ones that lumberjacks liked. There was some evidence that suggested a possibility, but there was no proof. Martha Perkins, Williams's widow, was asked for help. She had seen Isaac McAllister a number of times over the years, and knew some things about his body. When she saw the skull and long bones of the body, she hesitated, but in the end, she said it might be Isaac based on how tall he was and how he looked in general. Even though it wasn't a sure thing, it was an identification. Other people from Greenbrier were called in to look at the clothes and other things that were found with the body. Different people had different ideas. Some said they were sure it was Isaac's coat. Some, less so. The identification puzzle made people wonder even more about the case. If these were really Isaac McAllister's bones, it meant he ran away to the mountains when he knew he was going to be caught and died there from being too cold and hungry. Why, then, did you pick that valley? Was there something unique about that spot? And if those weren't Isaac's bones, then who were they? Also, where was Isaac? Sheriff Caldwell chose to find out more. To the valley where the body parts had been found. He planned a more involved expedition and brought enough food, water, and tools for several days to do a thorough search. What they found out over the next few days changed the case in a way they didn't expect. A cave that wasn't shown on any maps of the area was hidden behind a smaller waterfall and couldn't be found without actively looking for it. The entrance to the cave was small, so the men had to crawl through a small space to get to a bigger room. Inside, there was only. They found flickering flashlights and signs of recent living. There was an old sleeping bag, a rusted metal pot, some simple tools, and most disturbingly a leather-bound journal that had been kept dry in a wax cloth pouch that was waterproof. As he opened the diary, the sheriff's hands were shaking. The entries on the pages were written in shaky, sometimes firm handwriting that looked like it showed how the writer's mental health was getting worse. The date of the first entry was November 22, 1911, just a few days after Thomas Whitmore saw the bloody marks on Isaac's cabin's porch. The most recent entries were made in January 1912, which was 2 months before the trackers came to this faraway valley in the spring. That disturbing diary, found in that hidden cave behind the waterfall, showed what was going through Isaac McAllister's mind, if the body was really his, and those words were written by him. When Sheriff Caldwell got the diary back from Greenbrier, he read every page for days, every sentence, trying to figure out not only what was written, but also what it meant about what had happened in the Tennessee mountains. The first few entries in the diary made sense. Isaac, or whoever the author was, wrote about how quickly he left the estate when he found out that Thomas Whitmore had seen evidence that pointed the finger at him. The author said he or she watched from a distance as the merchant looked at the porch and wrote down the exact moment Thomas decided to leave quickly to call the police. That was the sign that time was running out and that years of secrets were about to be revealed in the harsh light of justice. It wasn't a random choice to run away to that valley. The diary says that the author had known about that cave for a long time, ever since he first came to the area and started exploring the mountains. He had kept this hiding place a secret at all times. It was where he kept emergency supplies and could run away if he ever had to. That insight showed a level of planning that was both very interesting and very scary. Maybe Isaac McAllister was writing this. He had always known that he might have to leave at some point. The first few days in the cave were written about in the following entries. The author wrote about how the bitter cold got worse as November turned into December. He talked about the food and tools he had been able to quickly escape with, which were mostly flour, dried beans, salt, and a few sacks of flour. It also talked about people who tried to hunt and they fished to add to their food, but winter made it harder to do both of those things. Few animals lived there, and fish were less active in the cold. Every trip outside the cave came with the risk of leaving tracks that could be followed. However, it was the personal thoughts that made the diary really scary. The author began to write about the things that had made him feel alone and hopeless. The words were not direct confessions. Instead, they were attempts to explain away what happened and give reasons why the things that were done were okay. Messed up sense. He wrote about how hard it was to live in the mountains and how people came and went without anyone really caring. He also talked about how the law was far away and justice was just an idea in a place where it was already hard to stay alive. In a very long entry from December 5th, the author tried to explain how it all began. As the author put it, the first event happened years ago, not on purpose, but by chance. A traveler had come to his house and asked for directions and a place to stay. Evening. During the conversation, the traveler said that he or she was carrying a lot of cash. He had saved money over many years of work and planned to use it to buy land farther west. There had been a fight. After some words were exchanged, the situation quickly got out of hand. The diary didn't go into great detail about what happened the first time, but it was easy to see what it meant. What started out as a one-time, maybe impulsive event turned into a more organized pattern. The author tried to persuade. He told himself that he was only doing what he had to do to stay alive, that the people who were walking through his property were only there for a short time, and that no one would really miss him. These excuses were meaningless attempts to explain away things that were wrong. As December and January went on, the tone of the diary changed a lot. The words became less consistent, the handwriting became less consistent, and the sentences became broken up and sometimes didn't make sense. The writer started to explain. After reading the diary, Dr. Porter would notice signs that were consistent with progressive hypothermia and possibly malnutrition. People said he was always shivering, that it was hard to keep the fire going in the cave because there wasn't enough dry wood, and that he was always hungry. It was even scarier when they talked about voices and visions. The author wrote about hearing calls at night from outside the cave. The whispers seemed to come from the stone walls, and shadows moved along the edges of what he saw as the firelight flickered. He talked about seeing faces in his dreams, faces of people he knew but didn't want to name. He had tried to bury his guilt as deeply as the bodies on his property, but they were the ghosts of the people he had killed. One entry from the middle of January was especially scary. When the author wrote about leaving the cave in the snow, he or she was sure that someone was calling for help outside. He had been lost in the snowy forest trying to find where the voices were coming from, only to find that no one was there in the end. He had a hard time getting back to the cave when he tried to. He got lost in his own land for hours. The mountains he knew so well turned strange and scary all of a sudden. He finally found the cave again, but the cold made his fingers so weak that he could hardly hold the pen to write about what he had seen. The hardest parts of the diary to read were the last ones. The handwriting was so bad that it was almost impossible to read, and the words were often hard to make out, not complete or having no meaning. One entry, from January 23rd, was very short, with only a few sentences. The author wrote that the cold had seeped into his bones, that he could no longer feel his feet, and that he was always and deeply hungry. He said that he had run out of food days before, and that his most recent attempts to hunt or fish had failed. The last entry that could be read was on January 27th. It was only a few scrawled words. "It's no longer cold to me. Is that good or not good? Now the voices are stronger. I might want to pay attention to them. After that, there was only a page of scribbles that didn't make sense. The marks could have been attempts at writing, or they could have been the hand's uncoordinated movements, which were no longer following the brain's instructions. The last page of the diary was blank, a soundless space that meant the person who had written those words had died. Sheriff Caldwell told Dr. Porter what was in the diary, and the doctor gave his medical opinion on what. During his last few weeks in the cave, something bad could have happened to Isaac McAllister. The doctor said that hypothermia was more than just having a low body temperature. It was a process that affected every part of the body over time. The brain started to work in a crazy way, causing confusion, hallucinations, and finally a kind of torpor that came before death. When combined with severe malnutrition, Isaac's last days would have been filled with more and more physical and mental pain. But the question of... There was still no definitive identification. The diary gave strong hints that the body parts found in the valley belonged to Isaac McAllister, but it wasn't proof for sure. The sheriff decided to talk to some of the oldest people who lived in Greenbrier and had known Isaac the longest. He gave them the diary and let them look at the writing in it. A number of people in the area agreed that the writing looked like Isaac's, especially on the first few pages where it was more consistent. Nearby. A merchant even brought in old receipts that Isaac had signed, and the similarities were very clear. When Martha Perkins saw the diary, she had a strong reaction. She knew some phrases and expressions that Isaac often used in conversation. They were like little habits that made him unique. It was an emotional confirmation of what the physical and other signs had already shown. Isaac McAllister's body was found in the valley, and the diary contained the last written words of a man who had died, did horrible things, and had to pay for them in the most lonely and hopeless way possible. When it was proven that Isaac McAllister had died in the mountains he knew so well, it ended the case in a strange way, but it did not bring peace. For Sheriff Caldwell and the people of Greenbrier, Isaac's death under the conditions described in the diary was a form of justice, even if it was done by the harsh nature of Appalachia instead of a court of law. But there was still a certain unease, In a way, the story wasn't over yet. That secret was still buried in those mountains, both literally and figuratively. The sheriff thought it was important to search Isaac McAllister's property more thoroughly. The first 3 graves found had bodies of known victims, but the journal said there might be more. There were vague references to years of activity, different incidents were written about more than once, and personal items were found in the hidden trunk. All of these things suggested that other people had been involved, met their deaths in that quiet clearing. In the late spring of 1912, a planned operation to dig was set up. The sheriff called in men from nearby counties, some of whom had construction and earth-moving experience. Isaac's property was split up into sections, and each section would be looked at carefully. They started by looking at the areas closest to the cabin and work their way out to the edges of the property, checking the ground for any bumps or other signs of previous disturbance. It was hard work, and work that is hard on the emotions. Under the rising spring sun, the men dug, and their shovels brought up layer after layer of Appalachian soil. They looked for days and only found rocks, old tree roots, and plain dirt. Some people began to wonder what the point was of going on. Maybe the first 3 graves really did hold all the bodies. The diary might have been exaggerating. Or it might have been the work of a crazy mind trying to make its last moments seem more important. Then, one May afternoon, when tiredness was setting in, with the determination of an excavator, they made a discovery that would make the case even scarier. About 50 meters behind the barn, in an area partly covered by thick brush, the ground gave way under one of the workers' shovels, showing a hole below. When they carefully cleared the area, they found more human remains that were even further along in the decomposition process than the bodies they had already found. It was clear that this grave was a lot older from how deep it was and how bad the remains were. "Hi, Dr. Porter," was called back. During those months, his job had turned into a never-ending series of horrifying investigations, with each new discovery adding to the tragedy that was happening. Identifying this new set of remains proved to be especially difficult. Almost everything was just bones because of time, and there were no clothes or other personal items buried with the body. No matter who this person was, either they were robbed of everything before being buried, or their things had been lost or damaged over time. The discovery sparked the excavator's work to keep going with more energy. There could be more graves if there was a 4th one. They widened the search area, paying extra attention to spots where plants grew in a different way, or where the ground looked like it had been disturbed a long time ago, and their suspicions were proven. In the following weeks, they found 2 more graves with human remains in different stages of preservation. 6 graves were found on Isaac McAllister's land in total. 3 were found during. 3 more were found during the systematic spring search that followed the first investigation. In that remote area of the Tennessee mountains, 6 lives were cut short, and 6 stories came to a sad end. Even though the number was shocking, it was the time frame that really made the case scary. Based on how the bodies were decomposing and Dr. Porter's guesses, the deaths happened over a period of 8 to 10 years. Sheriff Caldwell put together all the information he could find about people who went missing in that time period in that region. The list was very long and sad. Some traders had gone on trips and never came back. Workers who were traveling and had disappeared between jobs. Hunters who went into the mountains and didn't come back. Prospectors who went after their dreams of getting rich and then disappeared. The Appalachians were very big and dangerous, and people often went missing there. The question is how many of these disappearances were real accidents, and how many were Isaac's fault. McAllister? The sheriff was able to figure out likely links between 5 of the 6 victims by using the things found in the hidden trunk as clues. The hunter, William Perkins, had already been named. The ring connected James Rutherford, the traveler from the unsent letter, to the second body. The most likely person whose body was found was a hardware salesman named Samuel Briggs, who had gone missing in 1904. His initials were found on a pocket watch. An interesting hunting knife was, known by the family of a man who went missing in 1907 and was named Daniel Crow. It was thought that the 5th body had something to do with Marcus Denton, the land appraiser that Preston Hughes talked about in his letter. The 6th body, which was the oldest and most damaged, was still not identified. There were no objects in the trunk that could be clearly associated with it, and the state of the remains made any physical identification virtually impossible. Dr. Porter estimated that the person had been buried there at least 10 or 12 years ago, perhaps even longer. If his estimates were correct, the death would have occurred soon after Isaac McAllister arrived in the area, possibly even before he officially purchased the property. This possibility raised even deeper questions. Had Isaac arrived in the Tennessee mountains already harboring violent tendencies? Was that first unidentified victim part of his earlier history, a crime committed elsewhere that had forced him to flee to this remote region? Or had something in the mountains themselves, in the isolation and solitude of that? Life? Awakened impulses that had previously lain dormant? These were questions that would likely never be answered. The diary found in the cave did not go back that far, and Isaac had taken his deepest secrets to that icy valley where he had perished. The Greenbrier community struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened in their midst. 6 people, probably more, had been murdered over the course of a decade, and no one had suspected. Isaac McAllister had lived among them, frequented the same establishments, participated in the same community harvests, and sat in the same churches on rare occasions. How could no one have noticed? How could someone carry such dark secrets while maintaining a semblance of normalcy? Pastor Josiah Turner, who had participated in the initial expedition to Isaac's property, struggled particularly with these questions. He had spoken with Isaac a few times over the years, even trying to convince him to attend church services more regularly. Now, looking back on those conversations, the pastor wondered if there were signs he should have noticed, words or gestures that hinted at the darkness that resided behind Isaac's calm eyes. But the truth, he eventually concluded, was that monsters rarely seemed monstrous. They were ordinary people, living seemingly ordinary lives, hiding unfathomable abysses beneath banal surfaces. Martha Perkins, who had lost her husband William to Isaac, went through a painful process of renewed grief. When William initially disappeared, she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps he was still alive somewhere, that perhaps he had gotten lost and would one day find his way back. Now, with the terrifying confirmation of his fate, that hope, however faint, was definitively extinguished. But there was also a strange kind of relief in finally knowing the truth, in being able to have a proper burial, in having a place where she could lay flowers and commune with her husband's memory. As the summer of 1912 crept over the Tennessee mountains, the case of Isaac McAllister began to attract attention beyond the county lines. Newspapers from larger cities like Nashville and Knoxville sent reporters to cover the story, and their reports painted a sensationalized portrait of what was being called the butcher of the Appalachians, or the predator of the mountains. Sheriff Caldwell detested these melodramatic titles, feeling they reduced the real victims and their families to mere footnotes in a horror story. Reporters swooped down on Greenbrier like crows, searching for any new angle, any detail, that might make their stories more appealing to distant readers. They interviewed residents, photographed Isaac's abandoned cabin, and attempted to gain access to investigative records. Some were respectful and professional, others intrusive and insensitive, disrupting the community's grieving process with their incessant questions. Martha Perkins was harassed so often that she eventually refused to speak to any reporters, locking herself in her home whenever she saw strangers in the village. But the media attention also brought some unexpected benefits. Families of missing persons across the region began contacting Sheriff Caldwell, asking if their loved ones might be among Isaac McAllister's victims. Each letter that arrived carried its own tragedy. Stories of parents who had lost adult children, wives who had lost husbands, siblings who had lost siblings. The sheriff responded to each one personally, comparing the descriptions provided with the remains found and the objects in the hidden trunk. Some of these correspondences led to additional identifications, or at least likely connections. A woman from a distant county wrote about her brother, a traveling blacksmith who traveled from community to community offering his services. He had passed through Greenbrier in 1966 and was never seen again. The description she provided of his tools matched some pieces found in Isaac's barn. Tools investigators had assumed belonged to Isaac himself. This discovery raised the disturbing possibility that Isaac had not only killed his victims, but had incorporated their belongings into his own life, using their tools, perhaps wearing their clothes, systematically erasing any evidence that these people had ever existed. Another letter came from a family in Kentucky whose patriarch, a man named Edgar Thornton, had disappeared while driving cattle across the mountains in 1903. Edgar was driving a small herd to sell at eastern markets and had planned to cross Tennessee following old cattle trails. The family never heard from him or the herd again. At the time, they assumed he had fallen victim to cattle rustlers, criminals who occasionally operated in the remote Appalachian regions. Now, with the revelations about Isaac McAllister, they wondered if Edgar's fate had been far more sinister. Sheriff Caldwell investigated this particular possibility with particular interest. If Isaac had indeed attacked a man driving cattle, what had happened to the animals? Cattle couldn't be easily hidden or discarded. He began inquiring with Greenbriers, oldest residents, those with memories stretching back a decade or more. Eventually, he found a retired rancher named Elijah Grant, who remembered Isaac McAllister showing up in town in 1903 with 4 head of cattle he claimed to have purchased from a passing trader. Isaac had sold the cattle quickly, netting a tidy sum that he used to improve his property. At the time, no one had questioned Isaac's story. Cattle traders passed through the area regularly, and informal transactions were common. But now, in light of recent, when they made those discoveries, that memory changed in a big way. It was possible, even likely, that Edgar Thornton owned the cattle and that Isaac had killed them to take the herd and any money that Thornton carried. The discovery made Isaac's crime seem even more planned and deliberate. Not only was he an impulsive killer, but he could also plan his killings ahead of time and make money off of them. As more information came in, Dr. Reporter started to become what he called an outline of Isaac McAllister's habits and ways of doing things. At the time, the idea of studying criminal behavior in a planned way to figure out why they do what they do and how they do it was still pretty new. Dr. Porter noticed that Isaac seemed to be very careful about who he killed. Most of the time, they were men traveling alone, people who didn't have many connections in the area, and whose disappearance could be easily explained by the mountain's natural dangers. There was never any proof that Isaac attacked groups or individuals that were supposed to be in certain places at certain times. There was also a pattern in the geography. Isaac seemed to get his victims to come to his property by saying that he was a good guide. He gave people directions, maybe a place to stay the night, and made situations where they could relax. The property that was far away was perfect for what he needed. Not too close to neighbors so that screams wouldn't be heard, but not too far away that it would look sketchy. It was that kind of place where a tired traveler would be glad to stay, but would have no idea of the danger that lay ahead. Dr. Porter thought Isaac probably attacked his victims at night, when they were asleep or at least less likely to be hurt. This would explain why there were no signs of long-lasting fights in the cabin and why no one had heard any noises. The attacks came quickly, were very violent, and worked well. After that, Isaac would have time to get rid of any obvious proof, bury the bodies, and make up stories about his life. There were guests who left early in the morning to continue their travels. This reconstruction of Isaac's actions showed him to be a patient and smart predator. He didn't go out and hunt. Instead, he set things up so that his prey would come to him. He hid himself in the mountains because he knew that people going missing in that area happened so often that no one would notice. For almost 10 years, this plan worked perfectly. Isaac McAllister had worked in plain sight, which was a common, if not exactly, beloved member of the Greenbrier community while collecting victims on his private property in secret. But Sheriff Caldwell was still interested in and worried about some parts of the case. The first was the question of why. The journal that was found in the cave gave reasons, but not real answers. Isaac had written about the need to survive and how people are always moving around, but these reasons were clearly meaningless. The things that were stolen from the victims were not very valuable. Isaac, they kept living simply. His cabin was simple, and he didn't have many things. If he did it because he wanted to get rich, he wasn't collecting the money from his crimes in a way that made sense. The sheriff started to think that the reason might have been more complicated and psychological than just material. Isaac might have been interested in having power over other people and being able to decide their lives and deaths. His life in the mountains, where he was very alone, may have changed the way he saw people. In his mind, turning other people into something less than human. It's also possible that he was on this dark path years before he came to Tennessee because of something bad that happened to him in the past. It was hard to find information about Isaac's life before he came to Greenbrier in 1899. It was like he had just appeared out of thin air, with no history, family, or connections that could be checked. Sheriff Caldwell sent a lot of telegrams to other states' police telling them about Isaac and asking about crimes or disappearances that haven't been solved that might be linked. Some responses talked about cases that were somewhat similar, but no clear link could be found. A sheriff in Missouri gave a very interesting answer. He talked about a string of disappearances that happened along old trading trails in the late 1890s. Over the course of several years, travelers had gone missing in remote areas where no one could find them. At that time, investigations had brought nothing to light, and the cases were eventually dropped. Cold, and they were fired. Could Isaac McAllister have had something to do with these disappearances before he moved to Tennessee? Had he learned how to be a predator somewhere else before he found the Appalachians as his final home? It was likely that these questions would never have a clear answer. The only person who could have given all the answers was silenced when Isaac was killed in that remote valley. The diary gave hints but didn't give all the answers. It was like seeing through a foggy lens, looking through a window into a dark room, seeing shapes but not all the details. Sheriff Caldwell had to accept that there would always be mysteries and questions that would never be fully answered. It became less and less important to the public as the summer and fall of 1912 went on. The news outlets moved on to other stories. Less and less letters came from families looking for missing loved ones, and slowly but surely, life at Greenbrier started to get back to normal. But the memory of what had happened would live on, never go away completely. Isaac McAllister's property was still empty. People didn't want to buy it or even live near it. The cabin started to fall apart over time. Its boards are rotting and its roof is sagging, and nature is slowly taking back its space. The families of the people who were identified held proper funerals for their loved ones. This finally gave them the peace and respect that Isaac McAllister had denied them. Martha Perkins buried William in the churchyard near where he lived, next to a simple headstone that listed his years of life and his. A sad ending. Other families did the same thing, making memorials for loved ones who had gone on trips and never came back. The sixth body, which had not yet been identified, was buried in a section of the cemetery set aside for unknowns. Its headstone only said unknown, victim of 1911, and a short prayer. The months after the funerals were a time for everyone in Greenbrier and nearby towns to think about what had happened. The case of Isaac McAllister showed not only the crimes of one person, but also the way things were set up. Dangers that people who live on the edges of civilization face. In 1911, the Appalachian Mountains were far from the law, Communication was slow, and people often disappeared into the vast wilderness without being seriously looked into. Isaac had taken advantage of these situations in a disturbingly effective way. Sheriff Caldwell, who had been through a lot in the past year, started working on a list of ideas to make the area safer for everyone. He suggested making a system for registering travelers, where travelers through small towns would leave information about where they were going and when they thought they would arrive. The idea was that alarms could be set off more quickly if someone didn't show up where they were supposed to. Even though it was a simple system that relied on people working together voluntarily, it was at least an attempt to build safety nets where none existed before. He also pushed for more cooperation between counties when looking into cases of people going missing. Often, a missing person in one county wasn't reported to the police in neighboring counties, which made investigations more difficult and less effective. The sheriff thought of a way for sheriffs across the region to share information about missing people through regular telegrams. This would help find patterns more quickly. At the time, it was a big idea that looked ahead decades to the kind of cooperation between state police that would eventually become the norm. Pastor Josiah Turner talked about the tragedy. From a different point of view, that is just as important. At first, he preached about how people should care more about and look out for each other in their communities. He said that being very alone was not only bad for your health, but also for your soul. People who live alone and don't have any meaningful relationships with other people may lose their humanity in small but deep ways. He told the Greenbrier families to reach out to people who lived on the edges of town so that everyone, even the most lonely, felt like they were a part of something bigger. His words hit home because Isaac McAllister had been just the kind of person the pastor talked about, a man who lived alone and had no family, close friends, or meaningful ties to his community. He had been with them in spirit, but not really. And in that self-imposed isolation, something had become tainted or distorted to the point where he could see other people as little more than chances or problems. It was a sad lesson in how much being alone can cost. Martha Perkins discovered. On her own way through grief, she became a voice for other families who had lost loved ones in unresolved cases. She started writing letters to families all over the Appalachian region to offer comfort and useful tips on how to deal with the authorities, honor the dead, and find some peace even when she didn't know all the answers. Because of her work, a small support group met once a month at Greenbrier Church so that people who had experienced similar losses could come together. They tell each other their stories and help each other. At the same time, Dr. Samuel Porter put together a detailed report of what he had learned from the case and sent it to several medical and legal institutions in the eastern part of the country. He thought there were important lessons to be learned about how to find and look into serial crimes, which is not a term that is used very often yet, but he thought it summed up what Isaac McAllister had done. Some big names in the field took notice of his work. In the fall of 1913, he was asked to present his findings at a medical conference in Baltimore. At that time, criminology was becoming the subject of more systematic study. One of the first public talks about what we now call the psychology of serial killers was given by Dr. Porter in Baltimore. He talked about the patterns he had seen in Isaac's behavior, how the crimes had been able to go on for so long because of Isaac's remote location, and how important it was to do thorough forensic examinations even, when bodies were already breaking down quickly. People were interested in his talk in different ways. Some doctors and lawyers there thought his ideas were interesting and important. Others thought the topic was too sad and not appropriate for a serious academic discussion. Once they got back to Greenbrier, life went on as usual. The weather changed. Harvest time came and went. Every day, births and deaths have always shown how much time has passed. But now there was a different kind of awareness, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. People in the village paid more attention to strangers walking through, asked more questions, and offered to help, but they also stayed cautious. The innocence that was lost could never be fully found again. However, that loss of innocence may have been good for them. Isaac McAllister's cabin kept falling apart slowly. During the winter of 1913, a very bad storm took off a part of the roof. Wildlife started building nests in the ruins the next spring. Nature was erasing the area slowly and steadily in its own way. Some people in the area said the cabin should be burned down on purpose because it had too much bad energy to be left alone, even though it was in bad shape. Some people said it should be kept as a disturbing memorial to show how bad people can be. In the end, nothing official was done, and the choice was left up to time and the weather. The clearing was getting taken over by the forest. Shrubs and young trees started to grow where Isaac had kept the space clear. After the bodies were buried, the graves were filled in. Exuded, but small depressions in the ground still showed where they had been. Birds made nests in the tree branches above these places. Some very bad secrets were buried in the ground, and squirrels were all over it. People went about their daily lives without realizing the terrible things that had happened. Case had long-lasting effects on the law and government that went on for years. Isaac McAllister's estate didn't have any known heirs, so there were a lot of questions about what should be done with it. The courts in the county. People had different ideas about whether the property should or could be sold, and whether the money from the sale should go to the families of the victims as compensation. Other people thought that the land should just be declared public land and become part of the forests around it. The government took a long time to make decisions because there weren't many clear examples to follow. At the same time, some of the families of the victims filed small civil lawsuits to try to get back the value of their loved ones' things that were found on Isaac's land. Since Isaac didn't leave behind much of value, these lawsuits were more of a show than anything else. They were an attempt to show that the victims were real people with rights, not just numbers in a sensationalized criminal case. As the First World War broke out in 1914, people in the United States started to pay more attention to events happening in other countries. The Isaac McAllister case, which had been in the news for months in the region, people started to forget about it as news of faraway battles and changes in geopolitics took its place. But for the people who were directly affected, the case would never be forgotten. Martha Perkins went to William's grave every week. Sheriff Caldwell kept a detailed file on the case in his office. He would look it over from time to time when new information came in or when people from outside the department asked questions. Dr. Reporter kept writing to academics who were interested in criminology and using what he learned to improve his theories, from looking at Isaac's victims. There was also a bigger, though less obvious, effect on culture. Around the Appalachian region, stories about Isaac McAllister started to spread and became part of the local folklore. Some of these stories were pretty close to the truth. Others were dramatically exaggerated and included supernatural or made-up details. Parents used the story to teach their adult children who were planning to travel to be careful. People traveling through the mountains became more wary of kindness from people you don't know. The story, which was basically true but became skewed over time, was turned into a kind of parable about the hidden dangers that could be found even in places that seemed happy and peaceful. Over the course of many years, the Appalachian Mountains stayed the same, and Isaac McAllister's case went from being a current tragedy to a memory of the past. By 1920, almost 10 years after it was first found, the abandoned cabin was mostly gone, having been eaten up by the trees. That kept moving toward the clearing that had been the scene of so many disturbing crimes. There were only a few rotting wooden posts and moss-covered foundation stones left to show that someone had built something there before. In 1918, Sheriff Henry Caldwell gave up his job. Years of hard work and the emotional toll of the case that shaped his last years in office had made his health worse. He made sure that all records related to the Isaac McAllister case were carefully archived before he left, and kept safe. He put together boxes of papers, photos, the diary that was found in the cave, and the victims' personal items that had not been returned to their families. A careful list of everything was made and kept in the county archives, along with a note that explained the case's historical and legal importance so that future generations could study it. Martha Perkins lived until 1937 and never got married again after William died. She kept helping the families of people who went missing until she died. In later years, he became a respected person in Greenbrier and all over the region. She was buried next to William in the churchyard when she died at age 69. Her headstone recognized both her life and her legacy of caring for and helping people who had lost loved ones. The support group she started lasted for a few more decades before it finally broke up because its members got older and the group's purpose became less important. Dr. Samuel Porter became a well-known figure in the field of forensic criminology. Many articles are written about how to investigate crimes and how to look for patterns in crime data. People in academia wrote about his work on the Isaac McAllister case, and some of the first police training schools that opened in the 1920s and 1930s used it as a case study. He wrote to police departments in several states and gave them advice on difficult cases. He also helped set up procedures for investigating missing persons and repeat crimes. When he died in 1941, he left a big mark on the early growth of forensic science in the United States. Isaac McAllister's property was never officially given to someone else or sold. Legal arguments went on for years, but in the end, it was just added to the nearby public lands and became part of the huge Appalachian forests. Hunters sometimes went through the old clearing, but they didn't know about its dark past. There were no signs of people left behind. Nature had done its job. Only people with a thorough. People who knew about the history could find the site by using geographical features, like how close it was to the stream and how the oldest trees, which had seen it all, were shaped. Only some of the changes Sheriff Caldwell suggested to make mountain travel safer were put into place. The voluntary registration system he envisioned never caught on with many people, mostly because it needed cooperation that was hard to find in a place where people really valued their own independence. Safety. At the same time, though, talking about disappearances between countries got better over time. This was especially true as technology improved and made it easier to share information quickly over long distances. Even though Greenbrier was in the middle of nowhere, it stayed a small mountain town as the 20th century slowly but surely changed everything. The roads got better and were eventually paved. When electricity came along in the 1930s, it changed everything. As cars became more common, travel distances shrunk. It had once seemed so big and lonely. With these changes, it became harder to keep up the level of extreme isolation that had let Isaac McAllister work for so long without being caught. But even with all of these changes, the story was never forgotten by the people who were alive at the time. People from different generations told it to each other at family and community events. Their grandchildren were told about the scary time when they found a monster living among them. About the people whose lives were cruelly cut short and the lessons that were learned from the tragedy. The stories changed as they were told again and again. Some details were blown out of proportion, while others were played down, but the main truth stayed the same. As the 21st century brought us the digital age and a renewed interest in old murder cases, Isaac McAllister's story was found again by a new generation. Researchers found Sheriff Caldwell's carefully kept files in the county records. The pages of Isaac's diary, which were stained and had shaky handwriting, were carefully scanned. Digital copies of old pictures of the cabin, the digging, and the men who were involved in the investigation were found and saved. local historians started collecting oral histories from the children and grandchildren of the families who were affected. This made a more complete record of that sad time in Appalachian history. Isaac McAllister's case is very important not only because of the crimes he committed, but also because of what? Tells us about life in rural America in the early 1900s. It was a time when communication was slow, and places were very far apart. People could disappear without leaving behind any obvious signs. It was back then when being geographically isolated could let human predators get away with their crimes for years on end. But it was also a time when communities were strong and, even when terrible things happened, found ways to work together to help those who were hurt and seek justice, even if it wasn't perfect. 6 confirmed victims of Isaac McAllister, and maybe even others whose bodies were never found, tell individual stories of lives cut short and possibly unfulfilled. William Perkins never came back from that last hunt, so Martha was left alone. James Rutherford never finished his trip west, and his letter home will never smell the same. People named Samuel Briggs, Daniel Crow, Marcus Denton, and the 6th man whose name has never been found all lost their lives because they trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. The sad stories they tell are a reminder of how weak people are and how important it is to never forget those who have died. If you go to the area where it all happened now, the mountains and forests are still beautiful and thick. The stream that used to be close to Isaac's land is still there, and the water is still clean and cold. Greenbrier is still a smaller village than it was 100 years ago, but it is still home to people whose grandparents lived through that terrible time. A small memorial can be found in There is a bronze plaque in the churchyard that was put there decades ago. It has the names of the known victims and a line for those whose names are unknown, but whose lives are not forgotten. When we read Isaac McAllister's story, we have to face some hard truths about people. It serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always show itself in clear ways, that horrible people can look completely normal on the outside, but it also shows how strong the human spirit is, how communities can heal from terrible events, and how important it is to remember and honor those who have died so that their stories don't get lost over time. There are a lot of hidden secrets in the Appalachian Mountains. Through the years, stories of triumph and tragedy have been told. The story of Isaac McAllister is just one of many like this, but it is still a powerful reminder of a very bad time in the history of the area. Even though the cabin is no longer there and the forest has taken over that spot, the memory of what happened there lives on in archives, has been passed down through generations, and is studied by people who want to understand the worst parts of human nature. Please subscribe to our channel. If this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history moved you in any way. We have more stories like this one that explore the dark mysteries and events that shaped our past. Write a comment about what you think about this case. Also, if you know of any other stories like this that we should look into, please let us know. Encourages us to keep telling these important stories. Thank you for coming with us on this dark journey through time and the mountains of